So yes, I'm going to be talking about pest control in grain stores, really looking at the vertebrate pests and vertebrate pest control procedures, monitoring procedures, focusing a lot on the prevention rather than just the cure, because that is as big, if not a bigger part of what we're actually doing. And you'll see the first bullet point I've got up there, we're looking at the codes of practice as well. So there are various assurance schemes out there which give some very good advice about how we can control pests in grain stores, prevent pests in grain stores, and really not spoil all the hard work that's gone into producing the grain in the first place of very good quality. It goes off for harvest, gets put into a grain store, and then the pests get into it, and before you know it, you've got something that is going to be rejected at the point of delivery into the flour mills. So we will be basing, or I will be basing the next hour very much on what is expected from a lot of the assurance programs and how we can be expected to control pests in that respect. I will also be looking at the invertebrate pests, so the insects and to a very smaller extent the mite as well, and then looking at the different types of insecticide applications and fumigants that we can use. So quite a lot to get into an hour. But the assurance schemes, I think the last gentleman that was talking from NABIM was saying this really, all of this is your proof of due diligence. Now, proof of due diligence is really, have you done everything reasonably practicable to prevent this sort of contamination happening in the first place? And obviously the type of contamination that we're talking about is the pest. So it will either be the physical contamination of the dead body or the live body in the case of a lot of the insects. It could be the contamination with rodent droppings, urine, but there's also other problems that pests can cause as well. Large infestations of insects in a grain heap, for example, can raise the temperature locally, and they can raise as well the humidity. Humidity carries with it other problems in grain, such as mold growth, and from mold growth you will then get the production of mycotoxins potentially. And so from the humble beginnings of a few insects in the grain, you could have a much bigger problem. And so that's something that we have to consider. So lots of different assurance schemes. The main one here, the trade assurance scheme for the combinable crops task, but we also have to bear in mind there are people like Camden BRI that are going to be monitoring your grain as well for any foreign bodies or chemicals and things like that may be in the grain due to admix treatments and things like that. Then we've got NABIM. Obviously, the gentleman prior to me has just spoken about NABIM, but we also have the things like the GTAS scheme, the GAFTA Trade Assurance Scheme. And they go into quite a bit of detail about what they expect from the way that the store is managed and looked after. And pest control forms quite a large part of that. There are 4 chapters dedicated to pest control. One of them talks specifically about pest and vermin control, really very much about the control of rats, mice within the store. And then we've got another chapter there, 18, the use of pesticides and fumigants. Very much, again, based around what are we actually doing to the grain when it's in the store. And this need for the grain passport and informing people what you actually put into the grain. And then there's 15.3, reporting insect infestation. Remember, the GTAS scheme is very much for the storekeeper, so it may not necessarily be their grain that they are looking after, but they do have a duty when they take the grain in to make sure that when it actually moves off to the buyer or to its final destination, that it remains in the same condition as when it was brought into the store. And so reporting insect infestation, reporting changes in temperature and humidity and things like that back to the owner for a decision as to what to do next is very, very important part of it. And then the use of, very specifically, the use of exploding bird scarers. So bird control within stores is very important, but incendiary devices like exploding bird scarers are not a good idea to use inside an enclosed grain store. They do, however, birds do have their very own appendices within that code, and that's Appendix 3, all about bird control, and I will talk briefly about that in a couple of minutes. What really interests me in a lot of codes and a lot of best practice material is not so much the stuff that is directly related to pest control. It's all the stuff that is related to best practice and best storage, because this is your, for want of a better term, or to coin a phrase, the integrated pest management, all the stuff that is done to prevent infestation happening in the first place. And so there is things around store construction. How do you construct a store so that pests cannot come in from outside? Rats and mice do not come in from outside and start infesting the grain heap. That is absolutely vital, and that is a huge part of your due diligence. Have you done everything reasonably practicable to prevent that from happening in the first place? Well, we made sure that the grain was stored, and we carried out inspections of the store to make sure that the pests can't get in the first place. What we call exclusion. Okay, cleaning of the store, another vitally important thing, particularly when we're talking about insect infestation, those residual insect infestations that are going to be present in any small quantities of grain that may be left over after the store's been emptied. What we don't want to do is dump a load of fresh grain on top of that and allow that infestation to build up inside there. So cleaning of the store, particularly between loads, absolutely vital. Again, store management, deliveries and inspection of intake and pesticide records, all important stuff. Really important one there is the personnel. It's no good having all these things in practice if the people who are working in the grain store aren't quite getting it. So training of personnel is absolutely vital. An understanding of why all these things have to be done and what are the problems that you could expect if they're not done. And now we'll be talking a little bit more about personnel later on when we start talking about the application of pesticides, because legislation dictates that those people should at the very least be trained and competent. And in many cases, if we're talking about plant protection product, it's not just trained and competent, it is also qualified in the use of those products as well. Material recall and crisis management is all well and good having an excellent grain store, but if you don't have a facility inside that grain store for quarantine, if something does happen, you've got a big infestation in some grain, where are you going to keep it to make sure that that infestation doesn't spread to the next, to the bulk next door to it or something like that? And then simple one that we should all be aware of, covering loaded vehicles. Birds cause major problems in grain by simply flying over it and dropping feces into it. You will find that throughout the assurance schemes and throughout the GTAS code, there will be mention of HACCP, the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, where you will break the store management down or the movement of the grain through the store and say, well, what could possibly happen to the grain at this stage? What problems could happen regarding contamination and things like that? That's brilliant, and that's very, very good when we're talking about chemical contamination, we're talking about microbiological contamination. When we're talking about pests, it gets to be a little bit more difficult to say, well, at that point, the pest would be a problem. A lot of the pests that we're talking about are transient. Rats and mice move around all over the place. Birds fly around all over the place. And therefore, you can't say that the HACCP program, at individual points, pests will be a problem. Pests are going to be a problem throughout the entire thing. And therefore, what we tend to say in any HACCP program is that pest control needs to be a prerequisite. In other words, it's got to be in place, it's got to be working properly in order for that part of the HACCP program to have been met. So what problems can they cause with regards to the introduction of pathogenic bacteria and things like that? Well, I've just broken that down into the two main vertebrate pest problems that we get. The rodents, they will carry with them those bacteria that are really concerned with the common food poisoning bacteria. Now, if we were to say that most pests will reflect the environment in which they live, now, that's a very, very broad statement, but what it really means is if you are a rat and you just spent most of your time living in a drain, then guess what? You are going to have the bacteria that are associated with that drain on the outside of your body, and when you groom and when you feed in those areas, those same bacteria are going to be passing inside your body as well, passing through your gut, and they will be present in the droppings that you produce as well. And so most of the common food poisoning bacteria will be a real risk within the rodents. More importantly, and something that is mentioned time and time again throughout most of the codes, is salmonella. Rat droppings can contain salmonella. Mouse droppings can also contain salmonella. We could usually say that, well, salmonella, it's got to be damp, it's got to be warm, humid conditions and things like that. Not necessarily true. Viable bacteria have been found in dry rat droppings. There is no question about that. Salmonella is an important one then. Leptospirosis, probably on the long term less important, but nevertheless, if you are actually working in the grain store with a rat infestation in it, there is going to be the risk of you picking up something like this. Leptospirosis, commonly known as Weil's disease, it's a bacteria that lives in the kidney of the rat and is expressed, it's passed out in the urine. Now, it doesn't survive very well in dry conditions, so the urine has to be wet. But if you are picking that up, absorption through cuts and abrasions or directly into the mouth and swallowed can result in some pretty nasty illnesses for yourself. And then we've got another one here, not really a disease or anything like that, trichinosis, minute roundworm. Really much more of an issue if we're talking about livestock farming, pig farming and things like that. So we won't worry too much about that. But let's move over to the next column there. We've got the pest birds. We'll talk a little bit about what the pest birds are later, but birds have been known to carry various illnesses. Psittacosis, again, a bacteria passed out in the droppings of the bird and then usually inhaled or passed in and formulates a lung-type disease in humans. Salmonellosis, again, salmonella bacteria in the droppings of the birds can easily be passed on, depending on the species and where they've been feeding and things like that. Gulls tend to be a problem in certain areas of the country. Those gulls, you'll usually find them wheeling around a landfill site or something like that. It's not uncommon, therefore, exactly the same as the rats and mice. If they're reflecting the environment that they're living, they're feeding in, any bacteria in the landfill site will be produced in the droppings. And if those droppings happen to be on the flat roof of your grain store or something like that, there is inherently a risk there very close to your product. Newcastle's disease or fowl pest is one of the earliest forms of avian influenza, and yes, that is something that can get passed into grain. It can be then get sent on into animal feeds and things like that, and there have been some quite significant outbreaks that then get passed on to poultry feeds and affect the poultry farming and things like that. And it really does affect the growth and the general well-being, the ability of the birds to put on weight, and therefore can result in the entire flock being, having to be culled. So let's just have a quick look now at some of the vertebrate pests that we come across within the grain store. We'll have a look at what we call the commensal rodents, and then we'll have a look at a few of the birds. So commensal rodents, brilliant little term. Basically what it means is commensal is a Latin name, living in close proximity to or to feed from the same table as man. So these are rodents that like to eat very similar products to ourselves. Most of them, grain-based products is certainly something that they will feed from. So we'll start off there with a house mouse. Mus domesticus, it's about 15 grams of animal, and it will eat about 20% of its body weight every day, which equates to about 3 grams of food. Great, so what? It's not going to eat the entire contents of the grain store. At least one of them by itself won't. However, they do have quite a rapid reproductive rate. Gestation period of about 3 weeks. They can produce between about 7 and 8 young in a litter or something like that. 3 weeks after that, they will have weaned. And there's no coincidence that both of those are 3 weeks, the gestation period and the weaning period, because they demonstrate something called postpartum estrus, which means that once she's given birth, a few hours later, she will be responsive to the male again, which means that the male will have his turn on her. She will be pregnant again for 3 weeks, boot the rest of them out and produce another litter. A couple of weeks after that, usually mice are sexually mature after about 9 weeks, which means they all start breeding then. And calculations have said, and this is a calculation, there's nothing particularly accurate about this, but a single pair of active breeding rodents can produce 1,000 individuals in a 12-month period. The fact is that most of those will die in the nest or something like that. But nevertheless, if you've got 1,000 mice running over your grain, each of those will be producing about 80 droppings in a day. That's 80,000 droppings every single day. Some of those have got the potential to carry salmonella inside them. It's no wonder that that grain would get rejected when it arrives at the flour mill and the grain gets sampled. Similarly, here we've got the brown rat. It's another rodent. It's much bigger. It weighs about 350 grams. It doesn't have as big an appetite as a house mouse. It'll only eat about 10% of its body weight every day. But that's about 35 grams, and so they will eat more weight for weight. Main difference between the two, other than the size and things like that, is the behaviour, or the requirement for water, should I say. The house mouse is able, provided the food is moist enough, it can take enough moisture not to have to seek out a freestanding water source. The brown rat, on the other hand, will require to drink about 60 mils of water every day, and so you will never really find a rat infestation very far away from a known water source. This could be outside the grain store, it could be in a ditch, it could be in a pond, it could be in the drain. It could also be on the top of the drain store in the gutters and things like that. So whenever you're dealing with rats, think about not only what are they eating, but where are they drinking as well. They've got a similar reproductive rate as well. 3 weeks gestation period, 3 weeks weaning. So it is possible for very large populations of brown rats to build up. They don't produce as many droppings as a house mouse, and they tend to be a little bit more fastidious. So while the house mouse likes to sprinkle its droppings everywhere, the brown rat tends to be a little bit more cautious and produces a little latrine area where it will produce about 40 droppings in that area every day. And then the last one that we're not going to spend any time on really, because we've not got many of these left in the UK, is the black rat, really around ports and warehouses, or port warehouses, where they're being brought in as imports more than anything else. All of them will feed quite happily on grain though, and therefore you've got a fantastic food source for them in their thousands of tons in the flatbed grain store. They are all rodents. And the key thing about rodents is that they've got continuously growing incisor teeth on the top and the bottom jaw. In order to keep those worn down to a sensible size, they gnaw continuously, or virtually continuously, which means that these are the incisor teeth here. They're fairly well curved, which means they've got quite a strong pressure to them. They don't shear very easily. They've got a very thick layer of enamel on the outer surface and some quite softer dentine on the inner surface, which gives them that chisel-shaped appearance. Keep them worn down, they gnaw. So they're not just gnawing on the things that they want to eat, they're gnawing on things that aren't that palatable to them at all. Eating the sides of the wooden sides of the grain store there, chewing through electrical cabling, which can result in some quite significant damage. But they can also chew through structural supports and things like that, causing structural damage to the grain store as well. I've already mentioned the droppings and how many are produced, 80 by the house mouse, 40 by the brown rat in every 24-hour period. So I mentioned before integrated pest management. And this is really all of those good things, those good management practices that we can put into place alongside the other tactics, such as the use of chemicals to control rodents and the use of traps, physical traps to control rodents as well. So this is a little circular thing that I've produced here. Exclusion. We stop the pests from getting into the grain store in the first place. For me to say, well, you need to restrict the amount of food available. Well, as I've said, you've got several hundred tons of grain inside the grain store, all of which is one of the favoured food sources for this type of rodent, then you would think I was a little bit mad by saying that. But if you can prevent access to the food by making sure that the grain store is proofed properly, it's not got any glaringly obvious access points and things like that, like we've got depicted there around the drain pipe, then essentially you're protecting your product. Another good way to protect the product as well is from hygiene, and that's to make sure that the external parts of the store have not got so much grain spilt around them that it is acting as a beacon to all of the rodents in the area to come and explore close to the store. So hygiene is very important. Cleaning, proofing, and then we've got the option to destroy, either by using chemicals or by using physical methods. And then no control procedure will be any good unless we carried out regular monitoring. So regular visits to the store to look for not just nibbles in the bait blocks, but also the evidence, the presence of droppings, the presence of little brown smear marks where the rodents tend to run all the time with bits of body grease coming off their bodies and leaving these little brown marks around their regular rodent runs. All of those things should be looked at, and then any control program is absolutely no good unless you write it all down. So there should be a reporting structure in there to say that baits have been inspected, the building's been checked, we haven't found any droppings, and we've had a look at all the different potential for proofing defects. You could talk all afternoon on this. This is a typical old-fashioned grain store with 12 different entry points for rodents. But these are the sorts of things that when you're carrying out your regular maintenance checks on your store, you need to bear these in mind. Missing air bricks, excellent. A mouse can squeeze through a 6mm gap to get inside a building. So anything obvious like this is going to be, they can get through a missing air brick in piggyback, 2 or 3 at a time. Broken windows, the connections, the gantry there between 2 different stores. So one may be infested, there's easy access to the next store along there. Vegetation growing right up the side of the building as well. So brown rats don't climb very well. Well, so we say, but if they've got the opportunity to brace themselves between 2 vertical objects, such as a drain pipe, either inside or between the wall and the drain pipe, yes, they will climb extremely well, and we definitely find them high up in grain stores. Same goes for the vegetation. They can climb the tree, and then they can use the branches to get over onto the roof. And then gaps under doors, the most obvious one, the rotting door at the bottom there, easy access to any young rodent. And then also, as I mentioned before, rats like water, which means they're never that far away from a drain. And so broken drains, old-fashioned drains without a water seal or a trap in them is all easy access for the rodents to get up and into the area. So monitoring and control, what can we do regarding monitoring? I mentioned before, we've got chemical control, we've got physical control, but all of those other things that I've just mentioned, the environmental management, habitat management, good store management, is as much control as throwing poison around the place. Effectively, adopting an integrated pest management program which incorporates all of those things, chemical, physical, housekeeping, maintenance, proofing, that is what we're really looking for, and that is the most effective way of controlling the pests. If you can prevent them, even better. So this is my, you'll see this again later, this is my image of a grain store. So here we have this is the grain store in the middle, that's your grain heap in the front of it there. We're monitoring for rodent activity, usually outside the grain store. The idea being that the grain store is proofed and so the rodents are not inside it. We just need to try and monitor for the rodents on the outside. The little red circles in there, those are internal monitors in front of the store, in the grain store. We've got external monitoring, and you may also have a grain wall inside there as well, which will give you a good few foot gap. And this is often where a lot of the grain tips over the top and never gets moved. It's also a very good undisturbed place. Most rodents are nocturnal, which means that they're going to be active at night. So what are they going to be doing during the day? They need a harborage. They need somewhere undisturbed where they can sit all day long and do absolutely nothing. Now, if they've got somewhere where they can sit and do nothing for about 12 hours, they're going to be very happy rodents indeed, especially if it's going to be close to a food source and a water source. And it's quite often the grain wall or the cavity wall or something like that that is the big culprit for rodent harborage. So to try and avoid a void is probably one of the best ways of restricting access to harborage. The GTAS code, and quite a lot of other codes, in fact, you can go right the way through the food chain from grain storage right the way down to finished products, and there will be a code about something where somebody is saying, well, best practice will be to do this. And we have to bear in mind all the time that it's not just the rodent that's going to be causing the contamination. It could well be your rodent control program or your rodent control method that could be causing contamination, which could be rodenticide, for example. So what we're actually being requested to do here is to ensure that poison baits cannot contaminate the commodity. It is therefore recommended that non-grain bait are used, grain baits spill, and obviously once they've mixed up with the grain heap, it's going to be difficult to tell one from the other. So they recommend that we don't use grain bait. They recommend we use a block bait, which isn't going to spill once the bait station gets knocked or something like that. May not be the most palatable approach, but that is a recommendation. Not absolutely definite, but it is a recommendation there. We can override that by saying, well, best practice dictates that, and if we're going to get on top of this infestation, we should be using something a little bit more palatable. Where possible, it's recommended that the bait should be positioned outside the storage area. Now, if anybody is actually doing their own pest control here, I strongly recommend that if you are putting rodenticide down outside, you should get a copy of what is called the CREW Code of Practice. This is the Campaign for Responsible Rodenticide Use. And that really does an excellent little document which gives some very good recommendation on how to use rodenticide, but also bearing in mind that we've been told here that bait should be positioned outside the storage area. We need to consider what else is going to be eating that bait other than rats and mice. Okay? If we're finding that, and we do find that things like kestrels and barn owls contain elements of anticoagulant inside their body, then they haven't picked that up from eating a rat, because kestrels and barn owls do not eat rats. House mice, by the very name, tend not to live outdoors. They like to be inside in drier, more sheltered, warmer areas. The things that the kestrels and the barn owls are eating are things like your field voles, your bank voles, and your small rodents that we wouldn't normally classify as a pest. But by doing this prophylactic baiting outside in rural areas, other things will be eating the bait, and then other things eat the things that have just eaten the bait. That's called secondary poisoning, and we should be trying to avoid that. I won't go into that too much more, because there's a whole other debate around that, around the stewardship of anticoagulants and things like that. But again, if you are carrying out your own pest control and you are doing a lot of external baiting, make sure you do it in accordance with the CREW Code of Practice. Bait stations are also mentioned in some of these assurance schemes and codes and things like that. Generally, the recommendation is a tamper-resistant bait station. There's no such thing as a tamper-proof bait station, because there's always going to be somebody who is going to be able to break into it. But every reasonable precaution is usually made by the manufacturer with an integral locking mechanism to make sure that people can't actually get inside the bait. It's also robust, which means that the bait station doesn't break easily and spill the rodenticide out into the area, or even worse, onto the grain itself, which you can imagine there would be rejections if actually rat poison was found amongst the grain. When you put it like that, rat poison, it sounds a lot more emotive than it does when you just mention bait. Okay. So we would apply those usually in discrete locations, usually where the rodent is running, or where the rodent, we think as experts, where the rodent is likely to be running. So we can try and intercept the rodent before it actually becomes established. There is often as well a requirement to make sure that these are tethered into place. I mentioned right at the beginning reporting and things like that. A plan of where you've placed all of these rodenticides is usually a very good idea. But in order to manage that properly, it's a good idea to have them tethered into place so that somebody doesn't pick it up and walk off with it, because then you've suddenly got something that you're no longer able to manage. You don't know where that's going to end up or where it has ended up. I said I'd mention personnel again, and I will do here, and I'll mention it again later when we talk about insecticides. But if you're going to be